You know, I have to sit here for hours and hours, days, weeks, before anything pops out that I feel is good enough to keep, that speaks to me.
There are artists who make music, and then there are artists who become music. Benny Andersson belongs to the second category. For more than half a century, this quiet, bearded Swede has sat behind keyboards and pianos, coaxing melodies out of thin air that somehow found their way into the hearts of hundreds of millions of people across every continent on Earth. He never particularly chased fame. He never seemed especially comfortable in the glare of the spotlight. And yet the music he created, those shimmering, bittersweet, irresistibly melodic songs, made him one of the most successful composers the pop world has ever produced. But behind every great melody, there is often a story that the music itself cannot fully tell. And in Benny Andersson's case, that story involves love, loss, guilt, silence, and, ultimately, a kind of quiet redemption that has taken decades to fully reveal itself. Now, at 78 years old, Benny is finally speaking with a candor he rarely allowed himself in younger years. He is confirming truths that fans long suspected, addressing the woman whose life became tangled with his at the very height of ABBA's extraordinary run, and reflecting on what it all means looking back from the far side of a long and complicated life. This is not simply a story about a pop group. It is a story about what happens to real human beings when the world turns them into symbols of something larger than themselves. To understand Benny Andersson, you have to understand where he came from. He was born on December 16th, 1946, in the Västastern district of Stockholm, Sweden, into a family where music was not a luxury or an aspiration. It was simply the air people breathed. His father Gösta played the accordion. His grandfather Ephraim played the accordion. And when young Benny was just 6 years old, they put one in his hands too, as naturally as another family might hand a child a football or a fishing rod. Those early years shaped everything. Through his father and grandfather, Benny absorbed Swedish folk traditions, the warm, communal sound of music made around kitchen tables and at village dances. But he was also a child of his era, and the records that came drifting through the radio, Elvis Presley, Caterina Valente, the great international pop sounds of the late 1950s, opened a second door in his imagination. From the very beginning, Benny Andersson was someone who could hold two musical worlds in his head simultaneously, and that rare ability would eventually become the secret ingredient in everything ABBA created. By the time he was 10, he had taught himself the piano, not because anyone told him to, not because he was enrolled in lessons or following some structured path, simply because he heard something in the music that he needed to find for himself. School, by contrast, held almost no interest for him whatsoever. At 15, he walked away from formal education entirely, choosing instead to spend his evenings performing at youth clubs around Stockholm. The decision alarmed people around him, perhaps, but was the only honest choice he could have made. It was during these years that Benny also experienced the first of the significant personal relationships that would define and sometimes wound him. He met a young woman named Christina Granville, and together they built something resembling a life. 2 children, Peter and Helen, and a shared involvement in a small musical group. It was tender and it was real. But Benny was 19, 20, 21 years old, and the future was pulling him in directions he could not yet fully see. In 1964, Benny joined a rock group called the Hep Stars, and almost immediately, everything accelerated. The band broke through with a hit called Cadillac in early 1965, and Benny found himself at the center of Sweden's pop explosion, a teen idol, a keyboard wizard, a young man whose face appeared in magazines and whose music played from radios across Scandinavia. But even at this stage, what set Benny apart was not his performing. It was his writing. He had an instinct for melody that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than craft or technique. Songs poured out of him. Sunny Girl, Wedding, Consolation, each one demonstrating that this was not merely a gifted musician, but a genuine songwriter of unusual natural ability. The partnership that would change his life began in June 1966, when Benny met Björn Ulvaeus. Their connection was immediate and almost uncanny. Two young men from different backgrounds who discovered within hours of meeting each other that they thought about music in remarkably similar ways. They began writing songs together almost immediately. It was a creative friendship that would outlast marriages, outlast ABBA itself, and outlast nearly everything else in both their lives. Then came a 1969 Melodifestivalen, Sweden's annual Eurovision selection competition, and the evening that altered the entire trajectory of Benny's personal life. Performing that night was a young singer of remarkable presence and vocal power, Annifrid Lyngstad, known to her friends and soon to her fans as Frida. She was striking, intense, and possessed a voice that could move between warmth and heartbreak in a single phrase. Benny was captivated. Before long, they were a couple. Around the same time, Björn had fallen in love with another singer, a golden-voiced young woman named Agnetha Faltskog, who had already begun establishing her own solo career. Two songwriters, two singers, two couples. And the sound they created when all four voices and instruments came together was something none of them had quite anticipated. The blend was extraordinary. Agnetha and Frida's voices complemented each other in ways that seemed almost mathematically improbable. One bright and plaintive, the other rich and smoky, the contrast between them creating a sound that was somehow instantly recognizable as belonging to no one else on earth. The story of ABBA's rise has been told many times, but it bears remembering just how improbable it seemed in the early years. Four Swedes, singing in English, competing in a contest, Eurovision, that the music industry largely regarded as a minor spectacle. When they took the stage in Brighton in April 1974 with a song called Waterloo, something happened that nobody had quite predicted. The song was irresistible. The performance was electric. And when the votes came in from across Europe, ABBA had won, and the world suddenly knew their name. What followed was one of the most remarkable commercial and artistic runs in the history of popular music. SOS, Mamma Mia, Fernando, Dancing Queen, The Name of the Game, Voulez-vous, The Winner Takes It All, song after song after song, each one a perfectly constructed world unto itself, full of melody, full of feeling, full of that quality that is nearly impossible to define but instantly recognizable when you encounter it. The quality of music that feels true. Benny was at the center of all of it. He and Bjorn were the architects, building the tracks from the ground up in the studio, layering sounds, experimenting with arrangements, pushing the production further with each album. Benny had a particular genius for finding the chord that shouldn't quite work, but somehow did. The unexpected turn in a progression that transformed a good melody into an unforgettable one. Producers who worked with him during this era speak of his musicianship with something close to awe. But ABBA was never just music. It was two love stories made public, placed on stages, turned into something the whole world felt it had a stake in. And that created a kind of pressure that is genuinely difficult to describe, a pressure that eventually became unsustainable. The first fracture appeared between Bjorn and Agnetha. By 1979, at the very summit of ABBA's global fame, the couple whose marriage had seemed to embody everything the band stood for announced that they were divorcing. The pain was real and deep. Agnetha, who had spoken over the years about her discomfort with touring, her fierce protectiveness of her children, her fundamental preference for a private life, found herself devastated. She later acknowledged that the dissolution of that marriage required serious personal work to survive, therapy, time, and a deliberate process of rebuilding. The song The Winner Takes It All, written largely by Bjorn and performed by Agnetha, came out of this period. It remains one of the most emotionally naked recordings in pop history, a song about the wreckage of a relationship delivered by one of the people who had actually lived through it. When people ask why ABBA's music continues to resonate so powerfully decades later, this is part of the answer. The songs were not simulations of feeling. They were feeling, compressed into 3 minutes and 40 seconds, and placed inside a melody that would not let you go. But there was a second story unfolding simultaneously, one that took longer to fully surface, and one that Benny Andersson has spoken about with greater difficulty. His relationship with Frida, Annifrid Lyngstad, had seemed solid, even as the Bjorn and Agnetha marriage was crumbling. They had been together since 1969, had married in October 1978, and were by all public appearances committed to each other and to keeping the band together. But behind that public image, something had shifted. Benny, by his own eventual admission, had fallen in love with someone else, a woman named Mona Norcliffe, whom he had met while ABBA was still very much a going concern. When Benny and Frida announced their separation in 1981, the public statement described the split in the carefully neutral language that people use when they want to convey maturity and mutual respect while concealing pain. But for Frida, the experience was not neutral. She had given a decade of her life, her voice, her creative energy, and her trust to this relationship. The revelation that Benny had already found his next partner before their marriage had formally ended was deeply wounding. He married Mona in November 1981, the same year his divorce from Frida was announced. The speed of it said something that no carefully worded statement could soften. Frida was, by all accounts, devastated. She had already endured more loss in her life than most people ever face. A mother who died when she was very young, a childhood spent with her grandmother in circumstances far from comfortable, the dissolution of a first marriage before she ever met Benny. She was not a fragile person. She had survived things that would have broken others. But the way her marriage to Benny ended left a mark that took years to begin fading. For decades, Benny said relatively little about this chapter of his life. He acknowledged the divorce. He expressed warmth toward Frida in interviews where the subject came up. But the full picture, the timeline, the overlap, the fact that his heart had moved on while the marriage was technically still intact, was something he was careful not to dwell on publicly. It was a chapter he kept closed. Now at 78, with the long perspective that age and a genuinely good life can provide, Benny Andersson has begun speaking with more openness about what happened between him and Frida. Not to sensationalize, not to relitigate old pain, but because at a certain point in a long life, honesty becomes more important than protection. He has acknowledged that the way things unfolded was not fair to Frida, that she deserved better than the situation she found herself in, that the speed of his remarriage reflected where his heart already was, and that knowing it hurt her is something he has had to sit with. These are not the confessions of a man consumed by guilt. Benny Andersson has lived a full and genuinely happy life since those years, with Mona Norcliffe, with his music, with grandchildren and friendships, and the deep satisfaction of creative work that still matters to people everywhere. But they're the honest acknowledgments of someone who understands that the people